Hi, this is Jerry Borrowman. I'm going to read one of 8 chapters from my new book, Catastrophes Heroes. This is one of the most interesting books that I've ever researched and written about because it tells true stories of man-made disasters. These were all avoidable except for the hubris, the incompetence, or the greed of some of the people involved in each of these catastrophes. The story that I'm going to read to you today is about Italy's Vajont Dam and what happened to it in 1963. A little bit of background. I first heard of this story more than 40 years ago when I was in a geology class at Idaho State University. It was so fantastic to me at the time that I almost couldn't believe that it happened. And yet our professor told us that it had and explained the reason why it was fully preventable. So with that, let's look into Italy's Vajont Dam and the catastrophe of 1963. This is a picture of the dam that you're seeing right now with an outlet on the lower left side releasing water from behind the dam as it stands today. Here we go. Mario Passini had successfully designed one of the strongest, safest concrete arch dams in the world. Rising more than 100 feet higher than the famed Hoover Dam, the dam formed a sharp V high above the village of Longarone, Italy, in the steep canyon walls of Vajont Canyon. It was a remarkable accomplishment of modern engineering, proved by a recent catastrophe of unprecedented proportions that left the dam standing and intact. Yet more than 2,500 people had perished in a fully predictable disaster that Passini had tried to avoid, but that had been forced upon him by powerful political interest and by the successors of a wealthy industrialist. Now, racked with guilt and overwhelmed by depression, he felt that he had no right to live when so many others had perished. Yet of the hundreds of people responsible for the tragedy, he was the only one who had expressed any public remorse or offered an apology. All the others involved called it an act of God, when in fact it was anything but. Passini was tormented as he struggled to make sense of how his great accomplishment had led to such a tragedy. Overview. As one of the Axis powers in World War II, Italy was the scene of some of the most intense fighting of the war. Like much of the rest of Europe, its economy was devastated by the destruction of combat. As a result, in the years following World War II, the Italian government was always on the lookout for public works projects to put people to work. In the late 1950s, they found the ideal prestige project, building the tallest concrete arch dam in the world. The new dam was to be sited in the narrow Vajont Gorge at the southern end of the Dolomite Mountains. Located 60 miles north of Venice, this project was expected to produce electricity, irrigation, and tourism. With so much public money to be spent, there was ample opportunity for graft to enrich the politicians and contractors who sponsored the project. Initial site assessments showed a variety of geological defects where the dam was to be built, specifically that it would rest exclusively on ancient limestone beds, which are subject to fracturing under pressure. The height of the dam was specified at 860 feet from base to crest, 130 feet taller than Hoover Dam. A concrete structure of this size and weight requires a stable foundation. A second problem was that the extremely steep slopes of Mont Tauk, which formed on one side of the canyon, were subject to landslides. The limestone layers were intermixed with thin clay layers that became slippery when saturated with rainwater. Additionally, these ancient layers of sediment tilted on a downward sloping incline towards the base of the valley floor, which increased the likelihood of slippage if the area was inundated by a reservoir. Well, despite these hazards, the opportunity to efficiently generate electricity based on the high head of water behind an 860-foot tall dam was just too tempting. Count Giuseppe Volpi, the former Italian finance minister, and at the time the dam was being planned, the current owner of the electricity monopoly for North Eastern Italy, SADE, pushed for authority to build a dam. Under intense political pressure, site engineers concluded that the chances of a large-scale landslides were extremely rare, given that, quote, areas of weakness were not identified in 3 test borings. It was fair to assume that any shear plane would have a chair-like form that would exert a braking effect, and that seismic analysis suggested that the banks consisted of very firm in situ rock with high modulus of elasticity. Well, with these conclusions in writing, Count Volpe secured the necessary permits to continue, and with great fanfare started construction of the dam in 1956. To compensate for the deficiencies in the limestone at the base of the foundation, the dam's designer, Carlos Amanza, and construction engineer Mario Pancini injected a 500-foot grout curtain to stabilize the base and abutments. This effort was successful and allowed construction to proceed. But a large-scale movement of the canyon wall in late 1958 caused a temporary halt in construction. 3 new engineering studies again warned that the base of Montauk was extremely unstable and would likely collapse if the dam was completed. All 3 recommended suspension of the project, but SOD ignored these studies and pushed ahead instead of responding to the warnings. Samanza and the government agencies that oversaw construction of the project filed lawsuits against journalists for bringing any attention to perceived deficiencies. The charge, quote, their reports acted against the common interests of the people, end quote. With such powerful political protection, construction of the dam continued. The concrete arch structure was completed in October 1959. It was a remarkable sight to behold. Comparable in height to an 80-story building, the new dam stood as high as the main structure of the Chrysler Building in New York City. To demonstrate the steepness of the slopes of the canyon walls, consider that the dam is 627 feet wide at the top, but just 89 feet wide at the base. It towers like a very sharp V in the majestic Vajont Canyon, high above the villages below. The dam was designed to impound 316,000 acre-feet of water, approximately 10 times greater than the water held by the St. Francis Dam in Los Angeles. Parenthetical note, that's one of the other stories in the book about the St. Francis Dam and its failure. Permission was granted to SOD to start filling the reservoir in early 1960, and full pool was achieved in 1961. The reservoir was full. At this point, it was considered likely that all electrical generation in Italy would be nationalized. So the company was determined to put the dam into full operation to achieve the highest possible price if the government decided to buy out the company. But there was a problem. The predicted landslides had started. For example, on November 4th, 1961, a small promontory on the eastern shore of the reservoir shuddered and then collapsed into the lake. This produced a large wave that rippled towards the western shore. At the same time, a large fissure appeared on the face of Mount Tauk above the lake. It was 3 feet wide and 9,000 feet long. This demonstrated the instability of the material on the eastern shore. In response to this, SOD decided that the best way to stabilize the mountain was to expose it to changing water levels and pressure. It was hoped that by doing so, the rock and clay would adjust through moderate movements until the material reached a new point of equilibrium in the environment of the reservoir. Thus, the lake was raised and held steady for a time, then lowered, then raised slightly, then lowered again. Each of these adjustments caused movement in the eastern abutment, but none so dramatic as to raise serious alarm. Still, engineers were so concerned that SOD decided to excavate a large bypass tunnel in Mount Salta on the western shore of the lake. This would allow a second way for water to exit the lake if a landslide occurred that was large enough to divide the lake into 2 parts. It was a very dramatic cure for a problem that did not yet exist. By 1962, the water level was raised again to nearly full pool in anticipation of the nationalization of SOD. Remember, Sod is the electrical company that at this point owns the dam. From their point of view, it was critical that the dam be labeled operational to get the maximum selling price. If it was labeled under test or non-operational, the government could purchase the dam at a fraction of its operational value. Even though there were extremely disturbing signs of instability on the Montauk side of the reservoir, Sod pressed for operational status. It was granted, despite the appearance of cracks in the homes on the slope of Mount Tauk above the waterline that were caused by ground movement. Paint splintered on the walls, doors warped, and a brand new school that Sod had built was so damaged by earth movement that it was deemed unfit for use. Even a brand new road built by Sod around the shore of the new lake shifted out of its original alignment, making travel difficult. Danger near the shoreline. What is remarkable in retrospect is that few people seem to have concerns about the integrity of the dam in the event of a large landslide, even those living below the dam. The most concerned group were those whose villages were near the shores of the new lake above the dam, particularly in the towns of Urto and Casso. Their primary fear was that people living on the eastern shore could be hurt if the land underneath them started sliding, particularly since landslides saturated with water move at incredible speeds. Their second concern was that a large landslide into the reservoir could create a tsunami wave that would wash up and over their towns. The small slides already experienced by the fall of 1962 had created waves that came worryingly close to the footings of the buildings on the shore of the lake. These concerns became so intense by early September 1963 that the mayor of Urto sent a letter to Sod urging them to lower the level of the lake. He pleaded that his fellow citizens felt as if they were living in a nightmare because of the constant concern that a wave could destroy their lives and their property. Sod did not respond to his letter. By this point, crews at the dam were near panic. The rocky slope on Mount Tauk was sliding down towards the lake, sometimes by as much as 70 feet per day. It was obvious that if nothing was done, the ramifications could be deadly. The problem was trying to figure out how to manipulate the level of the reservoir to minimize the chance of a landslide. The thinking was that if the water level dropped too quickly, it would be a shock to the slide-prone area that would precipitate a rapid collapse. If the water was lowered too slowly and an earthquake occurred, the inevitable tsunami wave was far more likely to cause serious damage. There was even the risk of some water overtopping the dam. So Sod began lowering the level of the lake gradually, but at exactly the rate that maximized electrical power generation. That was very convenient for Sod. Tuesday, October 8th, was a day of increasing anxiety. Movement of the eastern abutment was so severe that trees were falling over. The road built around the lake was completely unusable. By late morning, Sod sent out a warning that all people living on the eastern shore should evacuate the area immediately. They also suggested the residents of Casso at the upper end of the lake move to higher ground since, quote, landslides can create frightening waves in the whole lake, end quote. They were thoughtful enough to suggest that swimmers would be particularly vulnerable to such waves. Unintended consequences. Wednesday, October 9th, 1963, catastrophe. At 10:39 p.m., the entire slope of Mount Tauk collapsed into the reservoir in a mighty explosion. 800 million cubic feet of clay and limestone displaced an equal amount of water in the reservoir. This gigantic slide moved at the rate of 60 miles per hour as it slid into the lake in just 45 seconds. The effect was completely unexpected. The water in the lake rose more than 600 feet above the top of the dam, and then it fell over the front of the dam. This crushing waterfall created a shock wave at the base of the dam, more powerful than that of the atomic bomb that exploded at Hiroshima, Japan. Landing in such a narrow canyon, the displaced air blasted down the canyon, obliterating everything in its path: buildings, trees, rocks, and people. Nearly all the bodies of the victims of the shockwave were found naked, their clothes blown off their bodies by the force. Of course, the water itself quickly followed in a mighty wave that scoured away all remnants of human habitation in the narrow gorge. Once the water reached the mouth of the canyon, the wave flattened out into a wider pattern, but that was little comfort to the 2,500 people who were killed by the flood. The community of Longarone and its satellite villages were hardest hit with more than 80% casualties. Above the dam, the tsunami wave created by the landslide destroyed the town of Casso, as well as the lower buildings in Urto. Survivors who witnessed the landslide said it was as if the entire side of the mountain disappeared into a giant white cloud. At first, they thought the cloud was dust, but it was actually the water of the lake rising 600 feet into the air. It was an epic disaster, foreseeable and preventable. The dam survives. I'm going to switch over and show you a photo that I think is really interesting. So here we go. So what you're seeing here is a photo after the collapse of the dam. You can see all of the mud and debris that has come in, and right in the center of the photo at the bottom, you see the arc of the concrete arch dam with a small pool of water behind it, then all the massive earth that has come off the slope of the mountain, and then a new lake that's up above this debris. That's what the people had to contend with. Miraculously, with all of that pressure and debris coming behind the dam itself held. Well, there you go. Perhaps the most remarkable part of this story is that the Vajont Dam survived the catastrophe. It was so well engineered that it resisted the incredible increase in force and held firm as the water overtopped it. The highway across the dam was destroyed, ripped away by the force of the water passing over the concrete, but the dam itself had held. In fact, it is still there today. It appears as a huge white V when seen from below. It is an odd structure sitting high above the now almost completely, above the now almost completely earth-filled canyon behind the dam where the reservoir once rested. So massive was the amount of material sloughed by the earthquake that it is impossible to excavate. Now it is a large plain sheltering behind the 600 feet above the valley below. Two small lakes formed upstream from the slide and above the dam. As rain falls and the level in these lakes rise, water is released through the original outlet tunnel, plus the second tunnel built on the other side, high up on the canyon wall. Looking at the dam from below, one is struck by the beautiful waterfalls rushing from both sides of the mountain below the crest of the dam. Heroic efforts. BBC News correspondent Mark Duff interviewed several survivors of the catastrophe for the 50th anniversary of the collapse of the dam in 1963. Here is a story shared by Michaela Coletti, one of just 30 children to survive in the town of Longarone and the only survivor in her family. Her father, mother, sister, and grandmother all perished in the flood. She was just 12 years old on the night of October 9th, 1963. Quote, "I heard what I thought was a thunderclap. It was incredibly loud. My granny came into the room and said she was going to close all the shutters because the storm was coming. At the same moment, all the lights went out and I heard a sound, impossible to describe properly. The closest thing I've heard to it is the sound of metal shop shutters rolling down, crashing shut. But this was a billion times worse. I felt my bed collapsing, as if there was a hole opening up beneath me and an irresistible force dragging me out. I couldn't do anything. I had no idea what was happening. I was hurled more than 1,000 feet through the air and buried. When they pulled me out, there was a popping sound like when you open a bottle and someone said, 'We have found another old one.' I was just 12 years old, but I was covered in mud and completely black and must have looked like an old woman. I remember I was on the shoulders of the only fireman from the town to survive, and he kept stumbling over these bright, incredibly white, translucent rocks, and I kept asking him to put me down, but he wouldn't. There was this huge moon so close and so bright it scared me. I felt if I stretched out my hand, I could touch it. I've never seen a moon like it, so close and so huge. Then they put me in a car and I heard someone crying, and I suddenly realized it was me. Michaela regrets the fact that the bodies of her mother, sister, and grandmother were never found. Her father's remains were identified and he was buried, but the site is unknown. Markers commemorate the death of her family members, but their experience in death is unknown. A resident of Casso who lived above the reservoir reported that he was awakened at 10:15 p.m. by a very loud and continuous sound of rolling rocks. But this did not disturb him since there had been a lot of slight activity in the area. It was raining hard. About 10:40 p.m., a very strong wind struck the house, breaking the window panes. Then the house shook violently. There was a very loud rumbling noise. Soon afterwards, the roof of the house was lifted so that the rain and rocks came hurtling into the room on the second floor what seemed like half a minute. He jumped up and out of his bed to open the door and leave when the roof collapsed onto the bed. The wind suddenly died down and the valley was quiet, end quote. He had experienced the shock wave created by the tsunami water wave created by the crashing of the landslide into the reservoir. The 600-foot wall of water that overtopped the canyon crashed onto the valley floor at approximately 10:40 p.m. 3 minutes later, the shockwave blasted the canyon below the dam at supersonic speed, smashing out windows and shaking the earth with tremors. The destruction caused by the blast of air, followed by the jet of water, was incredible. For example, the massive steel I-beams in the underground powerhouse were twisted like a corkscrew and sheared. The shockwave was quickly followed by a 230-foot-high flood that tore down the valley. It destroyed nearly everything in the village of Longarone in the mouth of the canyon, except for a damaged church bell tower. Then the floodwave broadened and out before turning into the Piave Valley, where it wrecked the villages of Catasago, Parago, and Villanova. Unlike the St. Francis flood that took many hours to play out as it worked its way to the ocean, the destruction of the Vajont flood ended quickly, mostly because the area affected was remote and lightly populated. So fierce was the force of the landslide, shockwave, and crashing of water over the face of the dam that seismic tremors were recorded at earthquake stations over a wide area of Europe as far north as Brussels, Belgium. These stations established that the recorded waves were the result of the landslide, not its cause. That was an important distinction to rule out an earthquake as the primary cause of the disaster. The disruption in power that caused a blackout just moments after the water and shockwave destroyed the powerhouse was the first indication to the rest of Italy that something was wrong. As reports flooded in, rescue workers started making their way to the devastated area. The local Italian resources were supplemented by United States Army helicopters and paratroopers on assignment in Italy who aided in rescue efforts and bringing supplies into the devastated areas. In more than 300 flights, they ferried out more than 4,000 survivors. It was because of the earnest and heroic efforts of Italians and Americans working side by side that the surviving victims were saved from further suffering. Through the help of those who rushed to the scene, they were soon given medical attention, food, and temporary shelter. Their villages had been destroyed, but they were still alive. Lessons learned grudgingly. The owners of the dam quickly declared that the flood was an act of God, completely unpredictable and not a result of human error or faulty design. This was a hard case to make to the people living in the area. They had warned the government of the instability of Montauk and had watched as the electric company had manipulated the lake level to try to create a controlled slide. But before an independent investigation could establish cause and responsibility, the disaster was politicized by the communists, the Italy Communist Party, who had opposed the dam from the beginning. They declared the disaster to be the result of greed and mismanagement. The prime minister quickly reacted to this by accusing the communists of political profiteering from the suffering of the victims, and so he moved quickly to silence the debate. A trial was held in which a handful of engineers were found negligent. The government never sued the electric company for damages. The only person to fully accept responsibility was the construction engineer, Mario Pansini, who fell into such despair that he committed suicide. He had tried mightily to prevent tragedy, but was unable to resist the political pressures demanding construction of the dam in an area he knew to be unsuitable. For this, he paid with his life. Many of the survivors relocated to a new village, Vajont, southeast of the mouth of the canyon. The villages of Longarone and others were rebuilt with new housing for those who chose to return. The government also offered loans and subsidies to survivors who wished to start new businesses to revitalize the area. But the corruption continued, as most of these were granted to large industrial concerns that built factories and plants elsewhere using the credits intended for the flood victims. Within a few years, almost no one talked about the tragedy. It was an embarrassment to be avoided. It was many decades later that survivors started sharing their stories to keep the memory of that awful night alive. A memorial church designed by the noted architect Giovanni Michelucci was built in Longarone to honor both the victims and the survivors of the tragedy. Let me do another screen share so you can see what the dam looks like today. So this is a photo of the dam sitting above the village with no reservoir behind it. A pumping station was built on the upside of the dam to draw water from the small lake behind the dam into the overflows. And I will. In 2002, a visitor center was built at the crest of the dam so tourists can visit the site and see the irony of a huge dam impounding a dry basin that is now covered in vegetation. In 2006, a track and field event entitled, quote, Paths of Remembrance was inaugurated. This allows runners to go inside some of the tunnels used in construction and originally intended to aid in power generation. And that is the story of the Vajont Dam. I hope you've enjoyed that. I'm very glad that Shadow Mountain is allowing me to post this video. And I hope that you look at the book, Catastrophes Heroes, and consider reading the other 7 stories that are included in that book. This is Jerry Borrowman. Thanks for listening.